Today is from Kyle Hiskala. Kyle is a climate justice policy advocate with the Environmental Health Coalition, where he works on environmental justice issues to integrate their voices and ideas for communities and bringing them into local, regional, and state levels of government. Kyle, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Murtaza. Yes, as Murtaza mentioned, I'm with Environmental Health Coalition, and many of you are familiar with our work. So I'll try and focus the bulk of the conversation on the transportation work that we're doing. So next slide, please. Today we'll cover the context very quickly, environmental justice, then dive into some of the problems, and then look at some of the solutions. Next slide. So for the context, environmental justice communities in San Diego that Environmental Health Coalition does community organizing in include City Heights, Barrio Logan, Logan Heights, Sherman Heights, West National City, and of course, over the border, we also have work in Colonia Chilpancingo. Next. Quick refresher for those of you who are not familiar, this is what environmental injustice looks like for communities that are bearing the greatest burden of polluting industries, living next to ports, toxic waste facilities, heavy duty trucks. So this is the reality of what our overburdened communities look like, overpolluted communities look like. Next slide. And then measuring the health disparity in EJ communities is one of the clearest examples of where air quality results in asthma rates that are disproportionate. So Logan has an asthma rate that is 3 times higher than the San Diego County average. Next slide. So some of the problems that we're seeing in terms of transportation. The first problem is an obvious one, that California's largest source of greenhouse gas emissions comes from the transportation sector, so almost about half of all of our emissions. Next slide. The problem number 2 that we wanted to, I always try to raise this up in every space that I'm in, is that electric vehicles alone cannot be a solution to decarbonizing the transportation sector, due to the fact that there's extreme costs from a climate perspective and carbon emissions on the manufacturing and disposal of electric vehicles. So if you compare the carbon intensity per passenger kilometer of these different modes, you look at the bottom where we have light rail with overhead lines, electric buses. Those are way more climate efficient forms of transportation. And so in terms of limited time and limited resources, we really have to focus in on what we're going to be able to get the biggest climate benefit for our dollars. Next slide. And then the last problem I wanted to highlight is that the metals that are required for the manufacturing of vehicles are extremely destructive and costly to the people and the planet. So indigenous populations in South America, or even populations of low-income communities living in Imperial Valley, living next to lithium deposits, are going to bear the burden of our economic and systemic choices. So I just want us to bear that in mind, that an electric battery for an electric bus is going to move a lot more people over its lifetime than an electric car battery in a car that might move a far fewer number of people over its lifetime. Next. So to get into some of the solutions, the environmental justice outreach that we do time and time again, clean air, transportation, and housing come up the most when we talk about climate change and the problems that environmental justice communities are facing. Next slide. So the solution that we continually come back to is that communities who cannot afford, families who can't afford to buy an electric car today, who are transit dependent today will be transit dependent 10 years from now. So it's important for us to figure out solutions for transit dependent communities, and that's where we need to start. And of course, we have to go beyond just transit dependent communities and figure out ways to expand and improve the transit network to get more people on board. Next slide. Environmental justice organizations created a coalition, the Transportation Equity Working Group. I know some of the organizations on this call are involved, but this was a highly community-driven process with community members on the ground who were able to develop what their priorities are. I'm not going to read all of these off, but just to name a few, Blue Line Express, bus service every 10 minutes, bathrooms, a purple line, 24-hour service, electric buses. Like, these are grounded in community priorities. So if we're thinking about where governments can focus, here's the list directly for you all to prioritize. Next. I think I'm going to skip over this mostly, but I just wanted to highlight that there's some modeling that has been done through the California Transportation Plan 2050. And it requires us to look beyond it, but we've been advocating at the state level for a 25% reduction per capita in vehicle miles traveled by the year 2030. That represents, if we were to look at the lens of public transportation, about $70 billion over the next 8 years coming from the state and federal sources to invest in mass transit. Next slide. This is a final slide. I just wanted to leave you all with what prioritizing environmental justice communities looks like. EJ communities are consulted first and remain at the table. The clean air strategies that we all know about in our region are integrated into climate policies. And fast, reliable, and affordable public mass transit, of course, is key. Affordable housing must be paired with anti-displacement, and equity funding commitments need to be in climate plans, not just statements about equity, but following up with commitments to funding, and then investing in transit and EJ communities first. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kyle. Really appreciate all the work that Environmental Health Coalition is doing in our environmental justice communities in the region, and for all the insight that you provided as we are developing a social equity-centered regional decarbonization framework. I want to ask you, because you presented some of this potential solution on prioritizing EJ communities, and especially when you talked about transit dependent communities and expanding the transit outside the areas that are currently served. Do you have specific ideas or suggestions for action in terms of that approach towards expanding the use of transit?
I think that there's, it's like a multi-stepped process that takes place over a long period of time. And I think I was trying to express how important it is to invest in mass transit in environmental justice communities first. If we think about where do we want to improve our existing system, that's where the dollars should go first. The other ideas that exist are really laid out in the 10 transit lifelines. There's a video there that can, that there's 10 videos for each of the lifelines that illustrates everything from expanded frequency to express services, 24-hour services. There's, that's a really great place to come back to.
Thank you, Kyle. My next question is about heavy duty ZEVs, the drayage trucks, and I know you're partnering with other regional agencies as well. In terms of the gaps in our knowledge base, because we're trying to see how we can expand our worldview, our methods of thinking? Are there case studies from outside our region that we can learn from for future action and inspiration?
In terms of heavy duty
Hmm.
electrification.
Yeah, trucks and freight and drayage trucks.
Yeah. I think that there's a lot of work happening at the port of Long Beach, and California is sort of a trailblazer when it comes to electrification of heavy duty vehicles and drayage. And the Port of San Diego is really a trailblazer, and the California Air Resources Board is doing extensive research and analysis on what kind of technologies and programs and regulations need to be put in place. There's actually a hearing going on at this very moment at the Air Resources Board looking at the Advanced Clean Fleets rule. So I think in terms of this region, we can really lean heavily on the experts at the state level with the Air Resources Board.
Thank you, Kyle, and thank you for joining us while that hearing is also an important one going on right now. So my final question is about regional collaboration. You touched on several sectors, including housing and land use and air quality. So what potential role do you see the county playing in bringing everyone to the table for regional action?
Yeah, that's a really great idea and a really great concept. So some of the work that we did with the City of San Diego's Climate Action Plan update was we worked to pull in the air quality goals that were developed in the Community Emissions Reduction Plan that was developed with APCD, the Port of San Diego, the City of San Diego, City of National City for the portside communities. And we really strengthened the clean air section in the City of San Diego's Climate Action Plan. But that is just a plan, and in order to implement that, the county as a regional partner can really play an important role as a convener, bringing the port and APCD and the City of San Diego together as they work on projects to implement the actual plans on the books. So there's new frontiers being discovered in terms of decarbonizing transportation and advancing clean technologies. It's kind of forcing government agencies that have never worked together before to work together. And I think that that's where additional capacity and coordination and sharing best practices will be really helpful, so that if the City of San Diego is successful in strengthening its clean air section and finding ways to partner with the Air Pollution Control District, can that be shared with other cities and other municipalities that are working on centering environmental justice in their climate plans, so that we're not thinking only about greenhouse gases, but we're thinking about clean air as it is impacting our most over-polluted communities, because clean air is good climate policy.
Thank you very much. With that final note, clean air is good climate policy. Those are the three ideas for today. We need to move on after this to the implementation playbook component of what we're doing with the University of San Diego Energy Policy Initiative